All children grow up someday, but growing up meant something different for Wendy. Wendy was 2 years old when she realized her growing up was different from the others. One day, she picked a flower from the garden in the park and ran toward her mother. Mrs. Darling sighed and said, "My daughter, I wish you could always stay this little." That very day, she realized that one day she would grow up just like her mother. She understood that growing up is not always all that great. Wendy lived with her mother and father in a cozy red brick house, house number 14. Her mother was a truly lovely and sentimental woman. Before she got married, many people had proposed to her, but Mr. Darling acted faster than everyone else and won her over. Mr. Darling was a reserved man. He also had a good knowledge of business. He spoke about the value of securities in such a way that everyone admired him. But it was Mrs. Darling who managed the household finances. Mrs. Darling kept track of all the household expenses. After the children were born, keeping track of their expenses was added to her responsibilities as well. First Wendy was born, then John, and then their brother Michael. When Wendy was born, Mr. Darling became thoughtful. He wasn't sure if they could afford another mouth to feed. Mrs. Darling reassured her husband that everything would be fine, but Mr. Darling's calculations showed that children come with expenses, illnesses, and food to provide. It was the same situation with John and Michael. In any case, having 3 children was quite expensive, but there was no other choice. On the other hand, in order for the Darling family to behave like the rest of their neighbors, they hired a nanny for the children. The children's nanny was an experienced woman. She placed her bed close to the children's room so she could watch over them more closely. If one of the children coughed, she would quickly wrap a scarf around the child's neck. She believed in old-fashioned remedies. She treated the children with those same remedies. When she took the children to school, she walked quietly and with dignity. But if the children strayed from the path, she would pull their hands and become strict. When she dropped the children off at school, unlike other nannies, she didn't sit on the bench to wait for them. She would pace back and forth until the children returned. The other nannies didn't warm up to her. She herself didn't like the other nannies' frivolous conversations. The nanny didn't like Mrs. Darling's friends coming to the children's room, but even if they did, the children's clothes were tidy and their hair was neat. Mr. Darling knew he had hired a good nanny for his children, but he was hurt by the neighbors' gossip about her behind her back. Sometimes he also felt that the nanny didn't value him much. He even thought she hadn't taught the children how to behave with their father. Sometimes when the nanny was playing with the children, their maid Liza would join them too. Liza always wore a knitted hat and a long skirt. She was very petite, almost as if she were the same age as the children. The children played noisily. During playtime, joy and contentment would appear on Mrs. Darling's face, filling her with happiness. There was no family in the neighborhood simpler or happier than the Darling family. Everything in the Darling household was peaceful until Peter Pan arrived. Mrs. Darling was the first to hear Peter's name. She heard his name when she was tidying up the children's minds. We were surprised, but it's not surprising. All mothers, when their children are asleep, wander through their minds and tidy everything up. If you stay up at night, you'll see your mother doing the very same thing. It's just like tidying up drawers. At night, mothers kneel beside their children's beds and look at the contents of their minds with a smile. That's why, when you wake up in the morning, the bad and unpleasant feelings have been pushed to the back of your mind. Instead, your mind is filled with beautiful thoughts. I don't know if you've ever seen a map of someone's mind. It's much more interesting than a doctor's complicated map. It's mostly zigzagging. It's as if the zigzags are the roads of an island. In fact, the land of imagination is an island with colorful patches, coral reefs, stranded boats, natives, and even wild animals. On this island, there are also dwarves, with rivers flowing toward caves. Of course, everyone's imaginary land is unique to themselves. For example, John's land is a swamp where flamingos fly overhead. Michael's land is an Indian cabin. Wendy lives in a house with embroidered leaves. Michael has many friends in his land, but John is alone in John's land. His land is all alone. Wendy's friend is a tame wolf cub whose parents abandoned him. We've all been in these lands. It's true that when we grow up, we don't visit them anymore. but the sound of its roaring waves stays in our minds forever. The land of imagination is more beautiful than any other land in the world. It's full of adventure. There's no worry in it either. The land of imagination becomes real exactly 2 minutes before you fall asleep. That's why nightlights are left on at night. Mrs. Darling sometimes found things in the children's minds that she couldn't understand. One of them was called Peter. Mrs. Darling didn't know anyone named Peter, but Peter existed in Michael and John's minds. Peter would swim around in Wendy's mind, a name whose letters were bigger than all the other letters. So much so that Mrs. Darling felt Peter was somehow a bit full of himself. Finally, one night, Wendy confessed that Peter really was full of himself. Wendy told her mother that all children know Peter. You know him too. Peter Pan, everyone knows him. At first, Mrs. Darling didn't recognize Peter, but when she thought back to her own childhood, she remembered that she had known Peter Pan. Peter Pan, who lived with the fairies? She had heard strange and wonderful things about Peter Pan. For example, when a child dies, Peter Pan accompanies the child part of the way so that the child won't be afraid. Mrs. Darling even believed in Peter Pan before she got married, but after she married, she thought such a person couldn't exist. That's why she told Wendy she was sure Peter Pan must have grown up by now, but Wendy was certain that Peter Pan was the same age as her. Mrs. Darling told her husband about this. Mr. Darling, upset and angry, said that their nanny had put these silly ideas into the children's heads, until one morning Mrs. Darling found a leaf in the children's room. Wendy smiled and said, Peter had come again.
He's so mischievous, he makes a mess everywhere. Mom, Peter Pan is really kind. Some nights he comes to my bedside and plays the flute for me.
Mrs. Darling was surprised. She stared at Wendy with wide eyes. Wendy jumped out of bed to go have breakfast. But Mrs. Darling stayed in the room and stared at the leaves. Where had the leaves really come from? The slender leaves didn't look like those of any tree. Mrs. Darling searched the whole room. She tapped on the walls. She measured the height of the window. It was impossible for anyone to get into the room. Mrs. Darling, still puzzled and worried, left the children's room. That same night, something strange happened again. The house nurse was not there. Mrs. Darling bathed the children and put them to bed. She herself sat by the fireplace, busy with her sewing. The fire and the light from the night lamps made her eyes grow heavy, and she began to doze off. Mrs. Darling had a dream. She was in the land of imagination. A strange boy was also searching in her imaginary land. The boy's face was not unfamiliar. It was as if she had seen his face many times in the faces of women who have no children, women who wished they had such a little boy. Suddenly John, Michael, and Wendy appeared as well. In her dream, Mrs. Darling saw a little boy in the land of imagination. She was lost in watching the boy when the wind flung the window of the room wide open. A boy fell out of dreams, right into the middle of the room. The boy was bathed in light. At that moment Wendy woke up and saw the boy. She exclaimed happily, "Peter Pan!" The boy's clothes were made of leaves. He smiled, and his sweet teeth shone like pearls in the darkness of the night. Mrs. Darling screamed and woke up from her sleep. The room was calm and quiet. At that moment the door opened and the nurse entered the house. While awake, the boy quickly jumped out the window. Mrs. Darling screamed again. My God, was it a dream or reality? In any case, she was afraid the boy might fall out the window and get hurt. Terrified, she ran toward the window. But there was no one there. She looked up, but the boy was nowhere in the sky. She felt a star quickly pass before her eyes. She returned to the children's room. The nurse was standing in the middle of the room, holding something in her hands. Mrs. Darling approached and saw that the boy's shadow was in the nurse's hands. As soon as the nurse had seen the boy at the edge of the window, she had closed it, so the boy's shadow had gotten caught between the window. Mrs. Darling examined the shadow and confidently said, "It's just an ordinary shadow." The nurse hung the shadow outside the window. She knew the boy would eventually come back for his shadow. She thought if the shadow was on the window ledge, the boy would easily come and take it without bothering the children. But Mrs. Darling didn't want to leave the shadow outside the window. She thought she should show it to Mr. Darling. Mrs. Darling hesitated for a moment, thinking that if she told her husband about the incident, he would once again blame the nurse for everything. So she rolled up the shadow and put it in a drawer, waiting for a more suitable time to bring it up. The right time came a week later, on a Friday night. Mr. and Mrs. Darling had been invited to a party. The nurse was getting the children ready for bed. Michael didn't want to go to sleep. Mrs. Darling put on her white nightgown and went to the children's room, because Wendy liked to see her mother in her new dress and the necklace that was a gift from her father. Mr. Darling entered the room after her, still not having tied his tie. Mrs. Darling carefully tied the tie around his neck, thinking to herself that now was the time to tell him about the boy and his shadow. Mrs. Darling smiled and showed the boy's shadow to Mr. Darling. Mr. Darling burst out laughing and said, "I don't know the owner of this shadow, but to me it looks like it belongs to a mischievous person." Just then the nurse came in with Michael's cough syrup. Michael didn't want to take his medicine. He was being playful and dodged it. Mr. Darling puffed out his chest and said, "Come on, Michael, be a man. Stand still and take your syrup." Michael shook his head from side to side. Mr. Darling smiled. He patted Michael's head and said, When I was your age, I didn't complain. I always finished my medicine." Wendy stood beside her father. She tried to encourage Michael. She said, "Father's medicine was even more bitter." Mr. Darling smiled and bravely said, "Much more bitter." Michael gave in. He quickly drank his medicine, but as soon as it went down his throat, he burst into tears. The nurse tried to calm Michael down. Mrs. Darling brought her head close to Mr. Darling's ear and whispered, "Do you remember the boy's shadow?" Mr. Darling was distracted by the nurse. He didn't like anyone but themselves to be so close to the children. Mr. Darling angrily dismissed the nurse. He said he didn't want her around the children for now. Mrs. Darling, worried that the children would be alone at home at night, went over to the window. Before she latched the window, she stuck her head out to take a look around. She looked up at the sky. A cluster of stars had gathered around the house. It was as if they wanted to figure something out. A sense of fear crept over Mrs. Darling. She said, "I wish I could stay home tonight." Michael said, "Don't worry about us. As long as the nightlight is on, nothing will bother us." Mother closed the window. She took a deep breath and kissed the children. Mr. Darling spoke. "Don't worry about the children. Let's go. We're late for the party." The host's house wasn't very far away. Mr. and Mrs. Darling walked to the house at the end of the street. As soon as the door closed behind them, a commotion broke out in the sky. The smallest star in the Milky Way said, "Peter, it's time."